The late afternoon sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of EON Technologies' San Francisco headquarters. The 28th floor buzzed with a quiet tension that only insiders could detect. At first glance, it was just another busy day for a tech giant. But in the executive corridor, the air was thicker, heavier, like something was about to rupture. Grace Emerson, co-founder and chairwoman of EON Technologies, walked purposefully down the hallway toward the boardroom. Her heels clicked with precision, echoing softly off the polished concrete floors. She looked composed, professional, and unshaken, exactly how she had built her legacy over 3 decades. But today, she felt something beneath the surface, a chill, a current pulling her somewhere she hadn't anticipated. She was 5 minutes early for the board's private executive session. It wasn't an unusual occurrence. The agenda had been sent out 2 days prior, mostly standard items. Or so it seemed. Yet, she had this gnawing feeling since the morning. The kind that whispered of betrayal without ever speaking a word. As she approached the boardroom doors, a quiet voice called out from behind her. "Ms. Emerson?" She turned and saw Ethan Cole, one of the long-standing security personnel at EON. He was in his early 50s, always quiet, always polite. She remembered his name because he once walked her to her car during a late-night exit after a PR disaster years ago. That night, he had stood by silently while reporters screamed questions at her, shielding her with nothing more than his body and a calm voice. "Ethan," she greeted, surprised to see him standing alone in the corridor. He stepped closer, looked both ways, then lowered his voice. "I'm sorry to stop you like this, but I need to ask you not to go into that room." "Not yet." Grace narrowed her eyes. "Is there a security issue?" "No, ma'am. Not that kind," he replied. "But something is happening in there, something that shouldn't." She looked past him toward the boardroom. She could see silhouettes through the frosted glass. Laughter, movement. Nothing seemed out of place. "Ethan, I appreciate your concern, but this is a private board meeting. I'm the chair. I called it." He leaned closer, voice now barely above a whisper. "I overheard something this morning. In the executive lounge. Nathan Reed was speaking with 2 members of the audit committee. And a man I didn't recognize, probably legal counsel." Grace's lips parted slightly. Nathan Reed, her chief operating officer, had been her protégé. She had mentored him from the time he was a junior analyst, trusted him enough to give him the reins of daily operations. A bright mind, charismatic, and ruthlessly effective. "What exactly did you hear?" she asked, her voice now guarded. "They're planning to invoke an emergency provision to remove you as chair. Today. They have some kind of documentation regarding the 2019 financial statements. They're going to claim it was mishandled under your oversight and that it undermines investor trust. The motion will be presented as a vote of confidence." Her body tensed. She didn't move. Didn't speak. For a moment, the fluorescent lights above seemed to buzz louder than they should. "And you're certain of this?" she asked. Ethan nodded slowly, then reached into his pocket. "I wasn't supposed to, but I recorded part of the conversation. It's not much, just a few lines, but enough to show intent." He handed her a small device. Grace stared at it for a moment before taking it. She put in her wireless earbuds, played the file, and listened. She won't see it coming. The motion gets read, the vote happens before she can respond. We control 5 of the 7 votes. She's done. Another voice, Nathan's, unmistakable. She'll make it emotional, talk about legacy. But emotion doesn't move markets. Control does. The recording ended. Grace removed the earbud slowly, then exhaled, measured and long. "Do you know who the 5 are?" she asked. Ethan shook his head. "No. Just Nathan and 2 audit committee members for sure. I couldn't see the lawyer's face. The others? I'm guessing, not certain." Grace took a step back from the boardroom door. The betrayal stung, not because of its content, she had anticipated political moves before, but because of who was orchestrating it. Nathan. A man she had once called her second-in-command, perhaps even her successor. She thought she had raised a leader. Apparently, she had bred an opportunist. She looked at Ethan again. "Why are you telling me this?" He hesitated. "Because I've worked here for 17 years. I've watched you build this company, stand through 3 market crashes, a scandal, and 3 failed acquisitions. Most execs wouldn't survive a quarter of what you did. You built something real here. I couldn't just watch them do this. She nodded, her eyes still on the boardroom door. Thank you, Ethan. You didn't have to. That makes it matter more. He gave her a brief nod and stepped back into the shadows of the hallway, disappearing like a man who had simply done his job. Grace didn't enter the boardroom. Instead, she turned and walked slowly toward the west wing of the floor, where her private office overlooked the bay. As she walked, her mind was already racing, not with fear, but with strategy. She had weathered worse. But this was no longer about reputation. It was about truth, and about facing the thing every founder fears most: being erased from her own creation. As she closed the office door behind her, she picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts. She stopped at one name: Riley Chun, her former chief legal officer. Resigned 6 months ago after what was labeled a philosophical disagreement with the board. But Grace knew Riley was one of the few people who had ever spoken to her with complete honesty, even when it hurt. She tapped the number and waited. Riley? It's Grace. I need to talk to you. Tonight. By the time Riley Chun arrived at Grace Emerson's home in Pacific Heights, the sun had already dipped beneath the horizon, leaving streaks of deep orange and violet across the San Francisco skyline. Grace didn't typically invite former colleagues to her private residence, but tonight, conventions had no place. What she was facing wasn't just a political maneuver, it was a calculated betrayal. Riley stepped into the entryway and removed her coat. She looked the same as always, meticulous, measured, sharp as a scalpel. Even in jeans and a sweater, she carried the composed air of a woman who had once negotiated international IP settlements over a single espresso. I figured it was serious when you called, Riley said as Grace handed her a glass of wine. You don't do social visits. Grace gave a dry smile. You're right. And this isn't social. They sat at the marble kitchen island, a long silence stretching between them until Grace played the audio recording Ethan had given her. As the final words faded, Nathan's voice dripping with quiet triumph, Riley leaned back in her seat and let out a slow whistle. Well, that's bold. Grace nodded. He's planning to call a vote tomorrow morning. Claims they've got 5 out of 7 board members. He's positioning himself as acting chair under some emergency provision tied to investor confidence. Riley swirled her wine, thinking. 2019. Let me guess, the Beijing subsidiary? Yes. That was already audited. 3 times. Nothing illegal, just a revenue recognition delay due to regulatory delays. You disclosed it in the quarterly filing. Grace exhaled. They're framing it as mismanagement. That I withheld its severity, that it damaged investor trust. Riley's expression darkened. And you think they've doctored the internal memos? I don't think. I know Nathan. He's charming, articulate, and ruthless when it comes to leverage. I trained him to be all those things. I just didn't realize I was teaching him how to dismantle me. Riley set down her glass. I still have copies of the draft memos. And I remember the email threads. If they altered the language, metadata should show it. That's what I'm hoping. But I need more than metadata. I need human beings willing to speak up. People who were there. Riley looked at her with a mix of skepticism and concern. You're not going to find many. Most of the senior team has either left or is under Nathan's thumb. Grace leaned forward, her tone quiet but firm. I'm not asking for an army. Just a few good people. The rest, I can handle. Riley studied her for a long moment. Okay. I'll reach out to a couple of people tonight. But Grace, are you sure you want to fight this? Grace met her eyes. If I let this happen, if I walk away quietly, they'll do it to someone else. Maybe someone who won't have the means to fight back. Riley nodded slowly. Then I guess we're going to war. By midnight, Riley had secured a meeting with 2 former UN colleagues, David Hall, who had once been the director of internal audit, and Naomi Fields, a senior analyst who had been part of the 2019 finance team. Both had left the company under vague terms, but Riley remembered that neither departure was voluntary. Meanwhile, Grace sat in her home office, surrounded by files and digital notes, building a map, not just of Nathan's possible allies, but of the timing, the legal angles, the pressure points. She wasn't preparing for a boardroom debate. She was preparing for a coup. Across town, Nathan Reed stood on the balcony of his high-rise apartment, nursing a tumbler of scotch. He had just gotten off the phone with Lester Vaughan, one of the board members, confirming that he was fully aligned for the morning vote. That made 4 confirmed. The 5th, Angela Soto, was still a maybe, but Nathan was confident. He had spent the last 2 months carefully planting seeds of doubt in her mind, about Grace's leadership, about the company's stagnation, about the need for generational change. Angela was pragmatic. She would side with progress. Inside, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his assistant, Jenna. All media briefs are approved. Press embargo set for 10 a.m. tomorrow. Statement attributes Grace's departure to long-standing health concerns and her desire to spend more time with family. Nathan smirked. He didn't hate Grace. In fact, he admired her. But admiration didn't equate to loyalty. He had learned long ago that power isn't inherited, it's seized. And tomorrow, he would do just that. Back in Pacific Heights, Grace reviewed the internal bylaws again.
Section 7.4, Emergency Transition Protocol.
It could technically be invoked with a majority vote under claims of immediate reputational risk. She had written that clause herself during the company's IPO preparations, never imagining it could be weaponized against her. There was only one path forward: expose the fabrication before the vote. She picked up her phone and called Ethan. He answered on the first ring. "I need your help again," she said.
Something discreet.
"Name it." "I need a camera installed in my old office. It has to be hidden, and it has to transmit. I need everything Nathan says or does in there recorded." "Done."
Gäller handle it before the sun is up.
"And Ethan," she added, her voice softening, "this might get messy." He paused, then said, "I've seen messy.
This is worth it."
By the time the city began to stir with the first light of dawn, a tiny pinhole camera had been placed behind the bookshelf in Grace's old executive suite. The feed ran straight to a secure server Riley had set up in her law firm's private cloud. Grace had also recorded her own statement, a direct message to the board, detailing the manipulation of financial data, the orchestration of a false health narrative, and the ethical violations it represented. It was not to be shared yet. Only if things went wrong. Just before 9 a.m., her phone rang. It was Riley. "David and Naomi are in. I've reviewed the metadata from the internal drafts. They changed the language, blatantly. And Nathan's name appears as the final editor." "Good. Have them write sworn statements. We'll need it in case of legal escalation." "And Grace," Riley added, "we also found something else." "What?" "There's a chain of emails between Nathan and an external PR firm. He planned your departure narrative 3 months ago, before the audit issue even surfaced." Grace closed her eyes. It wasn't a reaction. It had always been a plan. "Riley," she said quietly, "don't send anything yet. Let him walk into the boardroom. Let him present the story." "You sure?" "Yes. I want them to see exactly what kind of man they almost gave the company to." The boardroom on the top floor of EON Technologies had always been a space of sharp decisions and sharper personalities. This morning, however, it felt like the center of a quiet storm. The room was immaculate: glass walls, a long polished table, fresh espresso on a side tray, but tension clung to every surface like humidity before a thunderclap. 7 high-back chairs surrounded the table. 6 were filled. Nathan Reed sat at the head, his demeanor calm, professional, but beneath the surface, his nerves pulsed with electricity. He wore a charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, and a subtle blue tie, the same color Grace used to wear during key investor meetings. Deliberate, of course. To his right sat Lester Vaughan and Angela Soto, 2 seasoned board members with opposing styles. Lester was a tech investor in his late 60s, numbers first, famously unsentimental. Angela, on the other hand, was a former CFO who now sat on multiple boards. She had a sharp mind and an even sharper memory. The others included Ravi Menon, a logistics executive with a reputation for silence, Diane Perez, an HR strategist who had always admired Grace but stayed neutral in conflict, and Mark Liu, the youngest member and the only one still visibly uncomfortable in his tailored suit. Nathan looked at the clock.
9 heures du matin.
He cleared his throat. Thank you all for making time on short notice. I won't waste it with small talk. He tapped his tablet and projected a sleek presentation onto the glass wall behind him.
À minimaliste deck, élégant fond, Coulton.
The first slide read, Leadership in Transition, EON's Next Chapter. Nathan spoke with precision. As you're all aware, over the past several quarters, investor confidence has softened. Market competition is fierce, our innovation cycle has slowed, and our top leadership has grown, less adaptive. He let that sentence linger. Diane raised an eyebrow. Angela narrowed her gaze. Nathan continued. While Grace Emerson's legacy is undeniable, recent revelations regarding the 2019 audit, specifically the Beijing delays, have raised substantial concerns. Concerns that we believe must be addressed proactively, before they damage long-term stability. He clicked to the next slide. A headline from a small industry blog flashed on screen, Whispers of Falsified Financials at EON's China Branch. Angela frowned. That blog is speculation, Nathan.
Note évidence.
Nathan didn't flinch. It's enough to raise questions. And in this climate, questions are often louder than facts. Ravi finally spoke, his voice low. You're proposing what, exactly?
Nathan leaned forward.
A vote. Today. A resolution for temporary leadership transition, one that names me interim chair for a 90-day restructuring period. During that time, we will conduct an independent review, communicate openly with stakeholders, and prepare EON for its next decade. Silence followed. Diane looked to Angela, then to Lester. No one spoke. Just then, the door opened.
Grace Emerson walked in.
She wore a tailored black blazer, black slacks, and a pearl gray blouse. Her presence was like a shifting gravity. The room tilted the moment she entered. Apologies, she said calmly. I wasn't invited, but I heard you were discussing my departure. I thought I should be present. Nathan stood but didn't offer her a seat. She took one anyway, at the far end of the table. Angela cleared her throat. Grace, we were under the impression you were stepping down voluntarily. Due to health reasons. Grace smiled politely. Really? That's interesting. I must have forgotten sending that resignation letter.
Diane leaned forward.
So?
You're not stepping down.
No, Grace replied. Not unless there's a legitimate reason, one backed by truth, not fiction. Nathan spoke, voice still composed. Grace, with all due respect, this isn't personal. It's about fiduciary responsibility. She locked eyes with him. Then let's make it about facts. She opened her briefcase and placed several printed documents on the table, along with a small external hard drive. These are unedited email threads from 2019, metadata included. They show that the language in the Beijing memo was altered, months after the audit, and the edits were approved by you, Nathan. Not me. He opened his mouth, but she cut him off. I also have sworn statements from David Hall and Naomi Fields. They corroborate that the original documents were accurate and transparent. Their departures were not due to performance but internal pressure after resisting revision requests. The room was still. Angela leaned toward the hard drive. And this has been verified? Grace nodded. By Riley Chun, our former CLO. And if you're wondering why she's involved, she never actually signed a non-disclosure. Another oversight by whoever managed her exit. Nathan stiffened but didn't speak. Grace wasn't done. There's also evidence of communications between Nathan and a private PR firm, communications that began before any audit issue surfaced. Emails detailing a pre-written narrative of my voluntary departure due to health concerns. A narrative that would be released to media this morning. Angela turned to Nathan. Is that true?
Nathan hésitated.
It was contingency planning.
L'Estéresse face d'Arkend.
Planning her exit 3 months before this came up?
Diane shook her head.
Nathan, this doesn't look like strategy. It looks like manipulation. The silence that followed wasn't passive. It was shifting.
Something had broken open. Grace sat back.
I didn't come here to reclaim my seat with drama. I came to remind this board, and this company, that truth still matters. That leadership isn't about control. It's about character. Angela spoke next, her voice cool but resolute. I move that we suspend this vote until an independent third-party audit can be conducted. Effective immediately, Nathan will be placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. Lester nodded. Seconded. Mark Liu, who had remained silent the entire meeting, finally raised his voice.
I support the motion. Nathan stood.
You're making a mistake. Investors won't forgive confusion. We need clarity. Grace looked at him.
No, Nathan. You need control. The rest of us needs the truth.
As the board prepared the formal motion, Nathan remained standing, expression unreadable. He didn't lash out. He didn't protest. But his silence spoke volumes. The tide had turned.
En Grèce knew, the hardest paroissente ouvert.
It had just begun. By late afternoon, the media office at EON Technologies had already begun fielding questions. A few whispers had escaped the boardroom, just enough to rattle the edges of the investor network. No official press release had gone out, but industry forums buzzed with speculation. Was Grace Emerson being ousted? Was Nathan Reed taking over? Or had something far more complex happened behind closed doors? Inside Grace's temporary office, a modest conference room just 2 floors below her former suite, Riley Chen stood over a whiteboard covered in arrows, timelines, and names. Grace sat beside her, nursing a black coffee, while Naomi Fields and David Hall joined via a secure video link from Riley's firm. They're going to come at you sideways, Riley said, tapping a marker against the board.
N'attendons believ in direct retaliation.
He'll frame you as unstable, emotionally reactive, maybe even say you manipulated the board with selective evidence. He's not wrong, Grace replied, her voice even. I did choose when and how to present the documents. But I didn't fabricate anything. That's the difference. Naomi spoke up from the screen. There's another issue. I just got pinged by a friend who works at Graphite Partners. They're a private equity firm with a big stake in EON. Apparently, someone sent them a confidential report claiming Grace mishandled investor funds during the 2019 expansion into Southeast Asia. David nodded grimly. That's classic Nathan.
Plan the story, let fear do the rest. Grace leaned forward.
If he's turning institutional investors, we have to act fast. The board may have paused his ascension, but if shareholders lose confidence, they can force their own vote. I need to get in front of this. Riley picked up a notepad. Then we go public. Not with the whole story, that could backfire. But with enough transparency to create doubt about Nathan's version. You've got one asset he doesn't, loyalty from inside the company. Grace looked at her. You mean the employees? Exactly. If we can rally mid-level and senior staff, especially those who remember the early years, we create internal momentum. They won't all speak up publicly, but if enough of them show support internally, it will ripple up. Grace nodded slowly. I'll start with the R&D team. They've always trusted me. Meanwhile, in a sleek private lounge at the Four Seasons downtown, Nathan sat in a booth with Miles Heller, an aggressive communications strategist who specialized in damage control and narrative inversion. You lost the board, Miles said bluntly. That's a problem. Nathan didn't blink. Temporarily. But the shareholders are what matter. If we control the flow of information, the narrative can be salvaged. Miles nodded. You still have relationships at 3 major equity firms, correct? Yes. And I've already contacted one of them, Sentinel Capital. They're willing to request a special shareholder session if doubts about Grace's leadership grow. Then we give them those doubts. Not with lies, just reframing. Miles opened a file. Inside was a collection of out-of-context quotes, press clippings, and internal memos, each one carefully selected to cast Grace in a less flattering light. She's respected, yes. But respect doesn't equal competence. You built this image of her as the selfless founder, the visionary. Our job is to introduce another version, the outdated leader, clinging to legacy, afraid of change. Nathan looked down at the materials. His stomach turned slightly, but he said nothing. He had committed to this path. Now he had to walk it. Back at EON headquarters, Grace stood before the R&D division's leadership team. The room held about 20 people, engineers, architects, designers, many of whom had been with the company for over a decade. I know you've heard things, she began, and I'm not here to give you spin. I'm here to tell you that yes, there is a struggle happening. Not for power, but for truth. She looked around the room, meeting eyes. There are people who believe I've lost touch. That my vision is outdated. That I should step aside for the sake of efficiency. And maybe I have made mistakes. I'm not immune to them. But I've never lied to you. I've never compromised what this company stands for.
À Andresde.
It was Malika Tran, head of prototype integration. Is it true they're trying to say you mishandled the Southeast Asia expansion? Grace nodded. Yes. It's a distortion, based on incomplete data. We pulled out of that market because local regulations changed midstream.
Nathan Knudet.
He approved the exit strategy with me. Another voice chimed in. So why didn't you say anything before now? Grace's gaze softened. Because I believed integrity would speak for itself.
But for go something. Silence leave space for lies.
There was a long pause. Then slowly, one by one, heads began to nod. Malika looked around and said, "Tell us what to do. We're with you." Grace felt a lump rise in her throat but swallowed it. Just keep doing your jobs. And if someone from PR or the executive office asks you to endorse a leadership change, ask questions.
D'été saléinide.
That night, dozens of employees across departments quietly sent emails of support, some to Grace directly, others to the board. They didn't make public statements, but their internal solidarity formed a wall. And people were watching. At the same time, Riley reached out to a respected business journalist, Paul Sutton, known for exposing corporate manipulation. She didn't give him the whole story, only breadcrumbs, enough to get him curious. "I can't promise coverage," Paul said over the phone. "But if there's more to this than internal politics, I want the exclusive." "There's more," Riley replied. "And I'll show you. But not yet." Paul agreed to hold off, for 48 hours. That window was all they had. Meanwhile, Nathan's PR team released a subtle update to a closed investor mailing list. The subject line was careful: leadership health and strategic review. The content suggested a collaborative transition was underway, and that further announcements would follow pending board confirmation. It was soft manipulation, but it had impact. Grace's inbox began to fill with polite inquiries from longtime partners, just checking in. "Is everything okay? Heard something from Sentinel. Should we be concerned? Do you need to talk to the board directly?" She answered each one herself, calmly and directly. And as she typed late into the night, she realized something. This wasn't just about EON anymore. This was about what kind of leadership people believed in. The kind that seizes power quietly in boardrooms, or the kind that shows up even when they're pushed aside. Riley entered the room around midnight. "I just got word." One of Nathan's allies, Angela, she's wavering. She saw the staff memos. And she called Diane, asking questions. Grace looked up. "Then it's working." Riley hesitated. "But it also means Nathan knows we're hitting back. He'll accelerate." Grace closed her laptop. "Then so will we." By Monday morning, the pressure inside EON Technologies was no longer simmering. It had begun to boil. The board, unable to contain the mounting tension, announced an emergency internal hearing, a closed-door session where both Grace and Nathan would be given the opportunity to respond to allegations and present supporting materials. It wasn't a trial, but it felt like one. Employees received a curt memo, Leadership Transparency Session.
Attendance limited.
Summary to follow. The vague phrasing only amplified speculation. Inside the company's executive conference wing, the largest meeting room had been reserved.
Blackout curtain drone.
Security personnel stationed outside. No phones allowed. Grace arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in navy blue and carrying only a slim leather folder. Riley walked beside her, calm but alert.
"You ready?"
Riley asked. Grace looked at the glass doors ahead.
"No."
"But I'm going in anyway." Inside, the room had been reconfigured to resemble a tribunal. The board members sat on one side of a U-shaped table. At the open end sat two empty chairs, one for Grace, one for Nathan. When Nathan entered, he was alone. The air turned brittle. Angela Soto, whose expression had been unreadable for days, finally looked up. "This is not a disciplinary session," she said. "It is a review. But what we decide here will influence shareholder confidence, employee morale, and ultimately, EON's future. So we expect full honesty from both of you." Grace nodded. Nathan simply adjusted his cufflink.
Lester leaned forward.
"Let's begin with the audit. Ms. Emerson, we've received documents showing alterations to the 2019 Beijing memo. Your claim is that Mr. Reed authorized these changes. Is that correct?" "Yes," Grace replied. "The metadata shows it clearly. And I have email threads confirming the decision came from Nathan's office, not mine." Nathan's voice was calm. "What Ms. Emerson omits is that the changes were administrative, clarifying legal terminology to align with updated tax law."
A routine ajustement, note à cover-up.
Angela's tone turned colder. "Then why were those edits not logged in the official amendment report?" Nathan hesitated, just briefly. "It was an oversight." Riley passed a sheet of paper to Diane, who scanned it and frowned. "According to this, the oversight occurred after the report had been closed, and the amended file was used in our annual filings. That's not a minor clerical issue." Nathan's jaw clenched, but he remained composed. Mark Liu, quiet until now, spoke.
"Can y ask something?"
His voice wavered slightly but gained strength with each word. If this was all procedural, why did Mr. Hall and Ms. Fields resign so suddenly afterward? Grace answered, not looking at Nathan. "Because they refused to sign off on the altered memo. And they were told they were no longer aligned with leadership vision."
Nathan's eyes flashed.
"They were underperforming and uncooperative. We needed streamlined decision-making. EON was falling behind competitors." Mark looked down.
Ik knew Naomi.
She was many things. Uncooperative was not one of them.
Silence.
Angela broke it. "Let's move to the PR strategy. We've uncovered pre-drafted releases announcing Grace's resignation, documents dated before any audit concerns were raised. Nathan, do you deny authorizing them?" He looked at her. For the first time, he hesitated. "No," he said. "But they were never published." "But they were sent to investors," Angela snapped. "You set a narrative in motion. And that narrative could have tanked our stock price."
Nathan's calme craquait juste slightly.
"I did what I thought was necessary to protect the company's image."
A smooth transition.
"That's what investors want."
Grace leaned forward.
"No. What they want is honesty. You don't protect a company's image by erasing the truth. You strengthen it by facing it."
The word hung in the air.
Heavy, immovable. Angela looked around the room. "We've heard enough for today. We'll review the materials and reconvene tomorrow." As everyone rose, Grace turned to go, but paused when she saw Diane stand still.
"Grace," Diane said, softly. "Stay for a moment."
Grace nodded. Everyone else filtered out, including Nathan, whose shoulders were visibly stiffer than when he entered. Diane walked over to Grace. "I've been with this company for 16 years. I remember when you pitched the solar integration plan in a diner, because we didn't have a proper office yet." Grace smiled faintly. "That was a terrible coffee." Diane's voice softened. "I stayed silent because I thought I had to. But watching this, watching what Nathan did, it's not just strategy. It's betrayal. You don't deserve to be erased." Grace didn't speak. "You have my vote," Diane said.
"And you'll speak up tomorrow."
That evening, the internal chatter inside EON reached a fever pitch. The executive Slack channels were ablaze with theories, gifs, indirect references, everything short of open mutiny. Some managers began quietly rescinding support for Nathan. Others issued neutral statements about team unity. But one department, corporate legal, leaked an anonymous memo summarizing what had been revealed in the hearing. Within an hour, it was in the hands of 3 journalists.
Riley called Grace. Paul Sutton got the memo.
"He's calling me every 5 minutes. He wants to run the story." Grace stared out the window of her apartment. Lights twinkled across the skyline, but her mind was elsewhere. "Let him wait one more day," she said. "Why?" "Because tomorrow, we let the board vote. If we lose, Then we go public. If we win, we won't need to. At that same moment, Nathan sat in his penthouse, 2 fingers of bourbon in hand, watching the city with quiet contempt. Losing control had never been part of his plan. But he wasn't out yet.
À call cam trou.
He answered. It was Miles Heller. You still have 1 card left, Miles said. But it's risky.
Nathan Listend.
His lips curved into a quiet smile. Then let's play it. The morning of the final board session arrived with an overcast sky, as if the city itself sensed the storm brewing behind the steel and glass walls of EON Technologies. Grace Emerson arrived just after 8 a.m., flanked by Riley and a silent Naomi Fields, who had flown in overnight from Chicago to appear in person. The boardroom was quieter than usual. Angela Soto sat at the head of the table, her expression firm. The air felt different. The room had shifted since the last session. More cautious. More watchful. Diane greeted Grace with a small nod. Mark Liu looked nervous, but resolute. Lester, though typically unreadable, didn't meet her eyes. And then Nathan walked in, dressed impeccably, carrying a leather folder that seemed heavier than it should have. He didn't look flustered. In fact, he looked calm, too calm. Angela cleared her throat. Before we vote on any motion of reinstatement or restructuring, she said, we've been informed that Mr. Reed has requested to present a final submission. All eyes turned to Nathan. He stood slowly. Thank you. I realize I may not be in the board's favor at this moment, and I respect that. But I ask for 5 uninterrupted minutes to share something that hasn't yet come to light. He opened his folder and pulled out a set of documents, passing them to Angela, then Diane, then around the table. Grace frowned. The paper was familiar, too familiar. Nathan continued. These are internal communications and contract drafts from 2017 to 2018, when EON was negotiating a series of procurement deals for renewable energy hardware. In these emails, you'll find correspondence signed by Grace Emerson that approved purchases from a supplier, Solaris Dynamics, without competitive bidding. Grace stiffened. Her breath caught. That supplier, Nathan went on, was later found to have been partially owned by a venture capital firm in which Ms. Emerson's brother-in-law held a silent stake.
Angela Seiswidend.
What exactly are you implying? Nathan kept his voice level.
I'm not making accusation.
I'm presenting information. But the timing, the absence of a bidding process, and the familial link raise questions about transparency. Grace felt a cold chill in her spine. She remembered the Solaris deals. They had been made in a rush, supply chain constraints, tariff deadlines, and a narrow project window. There had been no intention of impropriety. But she had approved the fast track, and she hadn't known then that Mason's fund had exposure to Solaris's backers. At least, she hadn't known for certain.
Nathan spoke again.
I also have a memo from our then CFO, Richard Lanning, expressing concern about the appearance of conflict of interest. That memo was buried. Angela turned to Grace. Do you have a response to this? Grace's mouth was dry, but her voice was steady. Yes.
Il remembait the Solaris procurement.
It was approved under emergency protocols. At the time, we were racing a tariff hike that would have cost us millions in losses. We had no verified alternatives with the same certification levels. The supplier was vetted. She paused. And yes, I later learned that Mason's firm had indirect exposure to Solaris's parent company. I disclosed that information to our general counsel when I found out. I have no financial relationship with Solaris or any related entity. Diane interjected. Do we have that disclosure in writing? Grace nodded. Check the legal logs from Q2 2019. Angela looked at Riley.
Can you retrier vite?
Riley had already anticipated the request. It's on its way, she said, tapping her phone.
Nathan sat back.
He had played his card. Grace now had to defend her name, not only from recent betrayal, but from a buried oversight that had come back like a ghost. When the board adjourned for deliberation, Grace remained seated. She didn't move, didn't speak. Naomi sat beside her, silent. After several long minutes, Naomi finally said, You didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do everything right either, Grace whispered. But that doesn't make you guilty. Grace looked at her. That doesn't make me clean. Riley returned 10 minutes later with a printed legal memo from 2019. It confirmed that Grace had disclosed the Solaris conflict, even though she'd done so voluntarily, not under board requirement. The firm's general counsel at the time had reviewed the matter and marked it non-material. No further inquiry had been made. Grace held the document like it weighed 100 pounds. "It's not enough," she murmured. "It's honest," Naomi said. "That's more than Nathan's given them."
Back in the boardroom, the deliberation dragged. Voices rose.
Angela was the only one who kept steady, guiding the others through the logic of every argument. Lester, once a staunch ally of Nathan, wavered. Diane pushed firmly for Grace's reinstatement. Mark kept asking for clearer definitions and quantifiable risk. It was a room divided not just by loyalty, but by fear. Finally, after nearly 2 hours, the board summoned both parties back in.
Angela stood.
The board has reviewed the supplemental evidence presented by Mr. Reed and Ms. Emerson, including the legal memorandum dated July 2019 regarding the Solaris procurement matter. She glanced at the paper in her hand. "We find no evidence of material wrongdoing. However, we recognize the failure of communication and the risk it created. Moving forward, we recommend strengthening internal transparency protocols."
Grace exhaled, slowly.
Angela continued. "In light of the full picture, including Mr. Reed's unilateral PR actions, his failure to disclose internal memo suppression, and his role in the board miscommunication, the board has voted 4-1 in favor of reinstating Ms. Emerson as chair and CEO." Grace felt her body sag, just a little. Not in weakness, but in release. Nathan didn't move. Didn't flinch. But his eyes lost their sharpness. Angela turned to him. "You may remain as executive director of operations, pending review of your role in the memo alteration. Any future actions without board approval will result in immediate termination."
Nathan gave a curtenot.
His voice was faint.
Understood.
The session ended. Grace walked out into the hallway, Naomi and Riley at her side. The silence of victory was strange. Not celebratory, just quiet.
A necessary correction.
But as they turned the corner, they saw something unexpected. Staff. Not a crowd, not an ovation. But rows of people, engineers, analysts, designers, even custodial staff, standing quietly, lining the hallway. They didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They simply stood, hands at their sides, watching her walk by. Riley whispered, "They know." Grace swallowed the lump in her throat. She nodded at each person as she passed. It wasn't just a return. It was a restoration. Later that night, as city lights flickered and the rain tapped against the windows of her office, Grace sat alone. She opened her journal, one she hadn't touched in over a year. She wrote just one sentence. "Integrity bends, but it doesn't break." The boardroom had been cleared, the vote had been cast, and the headlines were already beginning to ripple through the business world. Yet Grace Emerson sat in her office, the CEO title officially restored, unable to feel anything resembling triumph. Across the city, news sites flashed alerts: Emerson reinstated after boardroom battle. Scandal at EON, the CEO who wouldn't fall.
Nathan ridait shadow stylum.
Grace turned off her phone. Naomi sat opposite her, sipping stale coffee from a paper cup. "It's over," she said quietly.
Grace shook her head.
"No. It's paused. There's a difference." She was right. In the hours following her reinstatement, 2 department heads had quietly submitted their resignations. One of them was from Nathan's old inner circle. The other, a mid-level compliance manager, cited moral fatigue in her notice. Grace stared out the window, fingers drumming lightly against her desk. "How many of them knew?" she asked Naomi.
Naomi set the cup down. Enough to be dangerous.
"Not enough to stop him." Grace nodded slowly. "And how many still believe in him?"
Naomi hesitated.
"Fewer. But they're still watching." Later that afternoon, Riley returned from a legal debrief with a fresh stack of folders. "There's something you need to see," she said, her voice unusually tense. Grace opened the top file. Her eyes scanned the contents quickly. Then she froze. "This is not the same memo from before," she whispered.
Riley shook her head.
"No. It's a different one. found on a backup drive that IT hadn't yet scrubbed. It contains revisions to the 2020 offshore accounts, ones that were never included in the official records. Grace's stomach turned. Who made these edits? Riley didn't answer. She simply handed over another sheet of paper, metadata logs.
The editor, L. Sanchez. Grace blinked. Liam Sanchez?
From Treasury. He left last year, Riley confirmed. Moved to a fintech firm in Boston. But his fingerprints are on several documents that appear coordinated with Nathan's timeline. Naomi leaned in. So Nathan had more help than we thought. Or, Grace said, her voice low, he wasn't the mastermind.
The silence hung heavy in the room.
What if Nathan was playing someone else's game? Grace asked. They looked at one another.
Riley broke the quai.
Then we need to know who that someone else is. 2 days passed. In that time, internal morale fluctuated wildly. Some teams celebrated Grace's return with cautious optimism. Others, more closely aligned with Nathan's former leadership style, remained tight-lipped. Angela Soto called for a private session with Grace. You've won, she said, pouring tea into ceramic cups in her corner office. But that doesn't mean you've stabilized anything. I know. Angela pushed a file across the table. The shareholders want a plan. Not a press release. Not a speech. A plan. Grace opened the file. 3 pages of performance projections, restructuring options, and stakeholder risks. Each number stared back at her like a quiet warning. Angela folded her hands.
You're a symbol now, Grace.
That means you're both powerful and vulnerable. If you don't act decisively, someone else will. Grace looked up. You think I'm still too cautious? I think you're trying to fix a damaged ship while pretending the waters are calm. Grace smiled, tiredly. They never were calm.
Angela stood.
Then steer like they're stormy. Or someone else will grab the wheel. Later that night, Grace found herself walking the company halls alone. The office was mostly empty, save for a few janitors and a late-night engineer hunched over a terminal. In the dim hallway outside the original server room, she found Phyllis, the night security guard, seated on her usual stool, watching the monitors. You're back, Phyllis said, barely looking up. Grace smiled faintly. It appears so.
I saw the camera feed the night Nathan came to clear out your office.
He looked like a man who'd already written the ending.
Grace leaned against the wall.
Maybe he had.
Phyllis glanced over.
Thing about endings, Ms. Emerson, they don't always belong to the person who writes them. Sometimes they belong to the one who survives them. Grace nodded. It was more wisdom than most executives had offered her all week. She made her way back to her office and sat in the dark, the city's glow painting soft shadows across the floor. She opened her email.
Un message satin red. Subject line, confidential, Sanchez connexion.
It was from a private investigator she had hired discreetly after Naomi suggested digging deeper into Nathan's early mentors.
The message was brief.
L. Sanchez formally interned at Blackridge Capital, 2014.
Direct mentorship under, Miles Seller.
Grace's heart skipped.
She read it again.
Then she picked up her phone and called Riley. We've been wrong, she said. Nathan didn't build this play alone. He was coached, funded, and maybe even promised a bigger stage.
Riley's voice came through the speaker, steady.
Et l'air. Not just him, Grace whispered. Blackridge's entire strategy is built on destabilizing leadership and installing their own proxies. They tried it here. They nearly succeeded. Riley was silent for a beat. Then, so what do we do? Grace stood, walking to the window. We find out who else in this company owes favors to Blackridge. We pull every contract, every speaking engagement, every expense report. And we follow the trail. Riley's voice was calm. That's going to rattle cages. I'm counting on it, Grace said. For the first time in weeks, she felt clarity, not peace but purpose. The reinstatement wasn't the end of the story. It was only the middle. And she had a storm to finish. The rain returned on a Tuesday. Thin streaks of water blurred the windows of the 19th floor, casting the city outside into a vague impressionist painting. Grace Emerson stood in front of the glass, phone pressed to her ear, her voice low but sharp. "How far back do the connections go?" she asked. On the other end, the private investigator, Joseph Teller, sounded wearied. "At least 5 years. Maybe more." Blackridge Capital has had silent equity in 3 of EON's secondary suppliers. Not direct holdings, but through shell firms based in Delaware and Luxembourg. Grace's grip tightened. "And you're sure Nathan knew?" "He didn't just know," Teller said. "He was the one who recommended 2 of those suppliers to procurement." Grace turned away from the window. Naomi sat at the long conference table, a legal pad in front of her, half filled with names and arrows. "So Blackridge didn't just whisper in his ear," Naomi said after Grace ended the call. "They planted people.
Infrastructure. Influence.
They nearly bought the company from the inside," Grace replied. Riley entered the room, tablet in hand.
Oui, triste travel record.
Nathan attended 3 private summits in 2021 that were also attended by Miles Heller. 2 of them weren't on his disclosed calendar. Grace walked toward the table, scanning the information Riley handed her. "It's not just about Nathan," she said. "He's the visible move." They were aiming for something much larger. If he'd succeeded, Heller would have gained de facto influence over EON's patent development pipeline. Naomi frowned. "Then why stop at EON?" "They didn't," Riley said. "We've started getting calls. Quiet ones. 2 former CEOs, one from a clean energy startup in Denver, another from an EV battery company in North Carolina, both said the same thing. Blackridge backed early investors. When the companies became viable, leadership was forced out under the guise of performance reviews.
Grace sat, slowly.
They've been buying the future." Naomi flipped the legal pad. "Then we have a choice. Go public, or go after them ourselves." Grace didn't answer right away. Her mind was moving faster than her voice. "If we go public now," she said, "they'll deny everything. They'll smear us.
C'est oui paranoia.
Reactionary. That this is a vendetta against Nathan." Riley spoke quietly. "But if we don't say anything, they'll keep going. They'll target other companies. Other leaders." Grace nodded. "Then we don't expose the theory.
We expose the evidence."
She leaned forward.
We build a dossier.
Not just on Nathan. On the entire web, transactions, dates, conflicts of interest, contracts. And we don't release it to the press." Naomi tilted her head. "Then who?" Grace looked up. "To Congress." Silence settled in the room. "You're thinking antitrust," Riley whispered. "Blackridge has moved beyond influence," Grace said. "They're manipulating sectors. If we can prove it, the DOJ will be forced to open an investigation."
Naomi exhaled. You realize what you're starting, right?
Grace nodded. "A war." They worked in secret over the next 6 days. The team included a former SEC compliance analyst Naomi trusted, an internal audit head from EON's Tokyo office, and even Phyllis, the security guard, who quietly handed over archived surveillance logs from the night Nathan smuggled files out of Grace's office. They called the Operation Horizon. The code name reminded Grace of 2 things. 1, that the truth was still ahead of them. And 2, that they weren't looking to destroy. They were trying to preserve. On the 7th day, a letter arrived in Grace's office. No stamp.
No return address.
Just a white envelope slid under her door. Inside was a single sentence. "If you push this, you'll burn with it." Grace stared at the words, her expression unreadable. She turned to Naomi and Riley, who had just entered. "They know," she said simply. Riley took the letter, scanned it, then dropped it into a metal tray and lit it with a match. The paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. "Let them know we're not scared," she said. But Grace wasn't sure fear was the right word. It wasn't that she wasn't afraid. It was that fear had calcified into something colder.
Something gardé. Résolve.
3 days later, the dossier was complete. Over 200 pages.
Financial record.
Insider emails.
Whistleblower testimony.
A timeline of Nathan's connections. and an appendix linking 3 other former executives from unrelated firms to similar replacement patterns, each one with a Blackridge tie. Grace stood with Naomi and Riley in the mailroom, holding the sealed envelope. "This could backfire," Naomi said. "We're accusing a major investment firm of corporate subversion." "We're not accusing," Grace said.
We are documenting.
She handed the envelope to a trusted courier with direct instructions: deliver it to the office of Senator Patricia Cline, ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee. Within 48 hours, a response came. Grace was summoned to Washington for a private meeting. The night before her departure, she sat alone in her apartment, reading through her own statement one last time. Her mind drifted to Nathan, not the man he had become, but the man she once knew.
À protéger.
A friend. A risk-taker. Somewhere along the way, he'd started mistaking ambition for destiny. She closed the folder, turned off the lamp, and let the darkness settle around her. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about every leader like her, pushed out in silence. Every company manipulated under the radar. Every young founder who didn't know they were walking into a trap until the walls closed in. And it was about making sure the next generation inherited not just a greener world, but a fairer one. She boarded the flight to D.C. just after sunrise, dossier in her hand. The horizon was still far off. But she was moving toward it. The conference room inside the Hart Senate office building was colder than Grace had expected. Not in temperature, but in atmosphere. It wasn't the kind of cold that came from air conditioning. It was procedural, bureaucratic. The kind of chill that settled into the bones of anyone who entered a system designed not for speed, but for scrutiny. She sat at the far end of a long oak table. Across from her sat Senator Patricia Cline, flanked by 3 aides and a senior analyst from the Financial Oversight Subcommittee. "You understand the gravity of what you're submitting, Ms. Emerson," the senator began, her voice calm but deliberate. "This dossier doesn't just name individuals. It implicates institutions. If even half of this is accurate, we are looking at coordinated corporate sabotage at a national scale."
Grace met her eyes.
"I'm aware. But I believe the facts speak for themselves." The senator tapped the thick binder in front of her. "There are names in here that sit on advisory councils, economic forums, even university boards. They used prestige as a shield," Grace said. "And silence as a weapon."
Cline closed the dossier.
"You realize this cannot be handled quietly. There will be hearings. Depositions. Public testimony." Grace nodded. "Good."
You want the truth on record.
The aide to Cline leaned in, whispered something, and the senator gave a slight nod. "We've already opened a confidential inquiry with the Department of Justice," she said. "Until then, we'll request voluntary cooperation from the named parties. That includes your former COO. "Nathan Reed," Grace said, her tone unreadable. "Yes. Him and 3 other individuals from different firms." The meeting continued for another hour. Grace answered every question, about Nathan, about the internal culture at EON, about the tactics used by shell companies to buy influence. When she left the room, she felt the weight of history pressing against her back. The kind of pressure that came not from fighting, but from witnessing how big the battle really was. Outside, Naomi was waiting. "How did it go?" she asked. "They're taking it seriously," Grace replied. "But this won't be fast." Riley joined them by the sidewalk. "We knew it wouldn't be." Naomi looked over her shoulder.
And Blackridge?
"Do we expect retaliation?"
Grace shook her head.
"No. Not yet. They'll wait. They'll try to discredit me first." And they did. The very next day, a piece appeared in a major financial publication. "Emerson's Grudge, CEO's Crusade Against Market Innovators Raises Eyebrows." The article painted Grace as a relic of old corporate culture. It praised modern investment accelerators like Blackridge for shaking up outdated hierarchies. It even referenced unnamed sources inside EON who claimed she had struggled with leadership transparency. Riley read the article aloud in Grace's hotel room. Grace didn't flinch. "They're using the classic playbook," she said.
Turn the whistleblower into the problem.
"But it won't stick," Naomi added. "We have documentation. Witnesses." "Doesn't matter," Grace said. "What matters is who believes the story first." That afternoon, she received a message on her private signal line. It was from Liam Sanchez.
I need to talk.
I'm done protecting them. Grace responded immediately, and within hours, she, Riley, and Naomi were seated in a safe house apartment just outside Arlington. Liam looked older than his 35 years. Tired. Drawn. I didn't know how deep it went, he said, eyes avoiding contact. At first it was just career advancement. I'd make connections, get bonuses, move up. Until. Grace prompted. Until I realized what they were doing with the data, he said. Blackridge doesn't just invest. They predict weakness. They engineer it. My job wasn't to optimize. It was to destabilize. You worked with Nathan directly? Riley asked. Liam nodded. He believed in it. Believed it was evolution. He didn't see it as betrayal. He thought removing inefficiencies meant removing people who held back the company's potential. Grace's voice was quiet. And me. You were a symbol, Liam said. Of resistance. Of stability. He thought the company couldn't evolve unless it left you behind. Grace closed her eyes for a moment. Not in pain, but in reflection.
What do you want from us?
Naomi asked.
Liam slid a flash drive across the table. Everything.
Emails. Contracts.
The internal Slack archive.
Even the recruitment pipeline they used to groom replacements inside other firms. Grace stared at the drive. Why now?
Liam hesitated.
Because the last time I checked, I still had a conscience. And because I know they're preparing to move again, this time on another firm. If we don't stop it, it'll just keep happening. That night, Grace sat alone in the safe house guest room.
She plugged in the drive and scrolled through the file.
The story was clearer now. Blackridge had created a playbook: identify companies with high-value IP, place insiders through strategic hires, wait for natural leadership fatigue, then execute a controlled transition with legal cover. They weren't just buying the future. They were replacing the people meant to build it. The next morning, Grace met with Senator Klein again. She placed the drive on the table. This is what you needed, she said. Not claims. Not theory. Evidence. Klein looked at the device, then at Grace. I hope you know what you've started, she said. I do, Grace replied. And I won't stop now. Within a week, the Senate Banking Committee issued a formal inquiry. Subpoenas followed. Nathan Reed was called to testify. So was Liam Sanchez. And Grace? She was asked to prepare her own statement for the public hearing. Naomi and Riley sat with her as she wrote it, each word weighed, each sentence balanced between emotion and fact. The world was watching now. This wasn't just about EON Technologies anymore. It was about the invisible hands that shaped the market, and the voices that refused to be silenced. The Capitol hearing chamber was unusually quiet for a morning session. A press pool gathered behind glass, cameras mounted but inactive, awaiting the signal to begin live coverage. Rows of aides, staffers, analysts, and members of the public filled the spectator gallery. At the front of the room sat Senator Patricia Klein, flanked by 5 other members of the Senate Banking Committee. At the center of it all sat Grace Emerson. She wore a charcoal suit, simple and clean.
No jewelry, no make-up beyond the barré essentiel.
In front of her rested a single sheet of prepared remarks. But her hands weren't on the page. They were folded calmly in her lap. Ms. Emerson, Senator Klein began, thank you for appearing before this committee. You are now invited to deliver your opening statement. Please proceed.
Grace stood slowly.
She took a breath. When I founded EON Technologies, she began, it was with the belief that innovation should serve humanity, not just profit margins. We created tools to build a more sustainable world, not to increase quarterly earnings. And for a time, we believed that was enough. She paused, letting her eyes sweep across the room. But over the past year, I witnessed the unraveling of that belief. Not because our products failed, or our mission lost relevance, but because power shifted. Quietly. Strategically. Invisibly. She looked down at her remarks but didn't read from them. I won't recount every detail. That's in the dossier this committee already has. What I will say is this: Blackridge Capital, through a network of shell companies and influence operatives, systematically infiltrated innovative tech firms, mine included, with the intention of replacing leadership, redirecting vision, and acquiring control from within. A stir passed through the room. She continued. This wasn't a hostile takeover in the traditional sense. There were no raids.
No headline.
Just well-dressed professionals with vague titles and silent mandates, placed in key positions until resistance seemed obsolete. She glanced briefly at Nathan Reed, seated behind legal counsel in the second row. His face was taut, unreadable. I was asked recently why I chose to speak up. Why I didn't just walk away and start over. After all, I had the resources.
The network. The experience.
But what I didn't have, what no founder truly has, is another version of their life's work.
Her voice grew firme.
They didn't just try to take a company. They tried to erase a vision. And by doing so, they endangered not just me, but every person who believes that progress should be principled. One of the senators leaned in, but did not interrupt.
I'm not here seeking restitution.
I'm not here to rebuild my brand. I'm here because if we allow this kind of silent corporate manipulation to go unchecked, we will not only lose companies.
We will lose the soul of innovation.
She sat. The room was still. Then, as protocol allowed, the first round of questions began. Grace answered them all, about the financial records, the chain of influence, the internal sabotage tactics. She referenced Liam Sanchez's testimony, Riley's forensic evidence, Naomi's legal groundwork. After nearly 3 hours, the committee recessed. Grace exited through a side hallway and stood alone beneath a marble archway, staring out at the overcast sky. Rain again. Always rain at the turning points. Naomi found her first. That was powerful, she said, voice soft. I think you moved the needle. I wasn't trying to move anything, Grace replied.
Juste placitoire de ballon.
Riley arrived a few minutes later with news. CNN and Reuters are already running clips. The phrase silent subversion is trending. Klein's office said public support is exploding. And Nathan? Grace asked. He left through a back exit. No comment. His legal team declined to answer questions. Grace nodded. There was no triumph in her expression.
Only à qui cette ligne.
The following days were a blur. The DOJ officially opened a probe into Blackridge Capital's practices. Subpoenas were issued. Several lower-level operatives turned witness. 2 senators who had accepted donations from shell firms connected to Blackridge issued public statements distancing themselves. Then came the biggest shift. A group of independent investors and founders formed a coalition, Founders for Integrity. It grew quickly. Over 70 companies signed within the first week, pledging transparency in investment structure and leadership succession. Grace was named as honorary chair. EON Technologies, under new interim leadership, invited Grace back in an advisory role, not to hold power, but to safeguard vision. She accepted. And Nathan? He settled out of court with EON. No admission of guilt. No prison. But his name was stripped from all professional associations. He disappeared from the business world, his once promising legacy reduced to a cautionary tale. Weeks passed. Then months. And one day, on the anniversary of her return, Grace stood before a new graduating class of engineers at Stanford, delivering a commencement address. She didn't speak of sabotage or betrayal. She spoke of responsibility. Of values.
Of the key power of refusal.
When they tell you disruption is the goal, she said, ask who it serves. When they say loyalty is weakness, remember that loyalty to truth is strength. And when they offer you shortcuts, ask what they're cutting through, because it might be someone's life's work.
The crowd rose in applause.
That evening, Grace walked alone through campus. The trees were taller than she remembered. The air lighter. She passed by a quiet garden where once years ago, she'd promised herself she would build something that mattered. She kept that promise. Not just by building, but by refusing to let it be stolen. And in doing so, she left behind more than a legacy.
She left à reminder.
That even in the quietest whisper, truth still has a voice.